Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're really excited and happy to host Andrew Steele today, who is an Oxford alumnus, having completed his PhD in physics at the University of Oxford. However, after his realization that aging is the single most important challenge of our time, he switched fields to computational biology and worked at the Francis Crick Institute. Today, he will introduce his first book, Ageless, The Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. Before passing on to Andrew, I just wanted to remind everyone that there will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please put your questions in the chat. Andrew, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me and for coming along, at least virtually, to this event. I thought I'd start off, by just giving a little bit of an overview of me. So as was just explained, I started out as a physicist, but I ended up changing career to biology. And fundamentally, the reason that I changed career was actually a graph, which is a graph I'm going to be showing you a few times during the beginning of this presentation, actually. And what I thought I'd do tonight is something a little bit different to some of the talks that I've normally done. There will be some sections that are the same if you've seen any of the talks that I've done before. But I thought this audience might be quite familiar with some of the ideas because I had a look at some of the speakers that you've had previously. So, for example, I'd normally talk about senescent cells and senolytic drugs because I think that's probably the most exciting thing happening in current longevity research. But then I thought you've probably heard that story, several times by now already. So that's something I'm going to sort of put on the back burner. What I thought I would do is really emphasize the sort of communication side of this, because the reason that I wrote the book fundamentally is to try and raise the profile of this field, because I think there's just so much exciting stuff going on. What we really need to do is communicate that to as many people as possible, to a really, really wide audience. So I was hoping that partly by, giving the talk that I'd probably give to a more normal, quote unquote, audience, that might give you a bit of an example of my sort of flavor of communicating this, which I obviously believe to be effective. That's why I'm doing it. And secondly, then I thought I'd go a bit deeper into some of the ethical questions toward the end of the talk, because I find that whenever I'm doing this, back when we could go to weddings and dinner parties and stuff, the first thing that people would often ask me when I told them that I was working on a book on aging biology was, well, what about overpopulation? It was very, very rarely, where can I get these amazing drugs? How can I extend my healthy lifespan? It was almost always about some kind of ethical pitfall, won't this cause massive inequality and stuff like that? So I thought I'd go into some of my answers to those questions rather than dwelling too heavily on all the scientific stuff. And it's a strange thing, actually, because I've written this science book, and it's, there's quite a lot of science in the book. But in a sense, I don't necessarily mind if everybody comes away understanding every single detail about, the role of mitochondria or, what DNA damage might mean. What I'm really fascinated to try and do is just to generate some excitement, but also to show that there's a fundamental, solid scientific underpinning in all of this stuff. So even if people don't understand every single word of the science, they can look in the back, they can see there are literally hundreds of references in there and see that this is a solid, important field. It isn't just it isn't just woo, it's an actual solid bit of science that's really, really exciting, really developing around now. So I've talked a bit already about my book. This is my book here. It's called Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. And it's out in the UK already. It's coming out in the US in a couple of weeks' time on March the 23rd. During the process of writing the book, I really wanted to make the case that aging is the biggest humanitarian challenge of our time. That probably seems a bit less strange to this audience than it does to a regular audience, but nonetheless, I thought I'd go through sort of my reasoning in depth, as I said, to give you an example of how I feel you can try and communicate this, try and advocate for this case. And that could make it quite a depressing book, because I talk about this enormous, cause of death, this enormous cause of suffering, all these different diseases that aging can, basically the aging process is the cause of. But then there's this optimistic side to it as well, because we're at a point in our history where we're on the cusp of what I think will be the greatest revolution in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics, because we're going to have these anti-aging medications that can treat the underlying cause of so many aspects of human suffering. And so much like an antibiotic, it's going to be a single drug that can treat a multitude of different diseases, not just treat them actually, but prevent those diseases from arising in the first place. So that's something that's genuinely exciting. And as I said, it's very real. It's actually happening in labs right now. So I said I'd start out by showing you this graph that changed my career. And it's a graph that I think probably quite a few of you will have seen before. It's the graph of just how old you are along the bottom, and then up the side, you've got your likelihood of death in that year. And we all know that old people are more likely to die than young people, but just how much really shocks me. A number that you probably know is something called the mortality rate doubling time for humans, which is about 7 or 8 years. It's the amount of time it takes when you get to adulthood for your risk of death in a given year to double. And that's a statistic that, as I say, I'm sure a lot of you have heard before, but I thought it was really worth just going through this graph step by step to show what this inexorable doubling really means. So let's start out at the very beginning of life. When you're 0 years old, your chance of not making it to your first birthday, is about 0.5%. And that's because, you could be born with some kind of genetic problem or a congenital issue. But assuming you make it through that first year of life, don't die of a sporadic infection or something, your odds of death actually go on decreasing throughout your childhood. So by the time you get to the age of 10, your odds of death are something around 1 in 10,000 every year. So that's 1 in 10,000 chance of not making your 11th birthday. And that's incredible. That's actually, the statistic is this makes current 10-year-olds the safest humans in the history of humanity, which is actually kind of obvious. It's just the place where the risk of death is lowest. And obviously risks of death in the modern world are lower than they've ever been. But it's absolutely incredible to think just how low your chance of death can actually be. Obviously, things are all downhill, or rather on this graph, uphill from there. So by the time you're 18, your risk of death every year is about 1 in 3,000. If you make it into your 30s, I'm in my 30s at the moment, then that means your risk of death is somewhere around 1 in 1,000 a year. And it's worth thinking, what that actually means in practice, or what that would mean in practice, were that to continue for the rest of your life. Because, 1 in 1,000, what that means is that on average, if my risk of death were to continue at approximately that level indefinitely, I'd have a decent chance of living into my 1030s on average, and could live very much longer still. So it's really incredible that the human body has this ability to maintain itself in a sufficiently sort of physiological, stable state to reduce the odds that it's going to fall so far, out of whack that you actually die, down to this incredibly low level. But of course, that state doesn't continue, and that's what this exponential growth is all about. As that risk of death doubles every 7 or 8 years, what that means is that what starts out very small can eventually get very big very quickly. So by the time you're 65, your risk of death in that year is about 1%. And again, it's worth just thinking about what that actually means. If that were to continue indefinitely, then again, you'd make it to 165. So clearly that isn't what happens. By the time you make it into your 80s, your risk of death is somewhere around 5% a year. And if you're lucky enough to make it into your 90s, somewhere up off the top of that graph, your risk of death in a given year is more than 1 in 6. So that means sort of life and death at the roll of a dice. So as a human looking at this graph, it's frankly a bit terrifying, because you've got this exponential wall of mortality approaching you from a very long, potentially a long distance away, or potentially, if you're a bit older, getting quite close. But as a scientist, this really intrigued me, because you just think, if there's this incredible synchronized increase in the risk of death and the risk of frailty and the risk of loads of other diseases, then maybe there's some kind of underlying process driving this incredible risk that makes these things happen all, such a suspiciously similar time. And that, of course, is the aging process. So we're going to have to look at, look in a little bit more depth. We're going to have to ask, what is aging? What is this process that's causing this synchronized increase in death? And what a lot of people think of when they think of aging are these very superficial signs, things like wrinkles and grey hair. Obviously, what a lot of this audience will know is that it isn't just that. It also comes with an increased risk of these terrible diseases, the leading killers in the modern world: cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, and so on. It also comes with a load of different kinds of loss. I've just listed a few here: vision loss, muscle loss, hearing loss, memory loss. And what I think of all of these as is, sort of an umbrella for the loss of the most important thing, which is our independence, our ability to go around, doing our everyday business. And that can be anything from getting around the house, unscrewing jars, getting up the stairs, playing with our grandkids, seeing our friends and relatives, all these different things that we like to do. This gradual loss of our faculties as we get older, removes those abilities from us. And then finally, there are other things that aren't directly related to aging, but are significantly worsened by the passage of the aging process. So something like an infection or an injury. If as a young person you break your arm, you might have a few weeks in a plaster cast for that bone to heal. If you're an older person and you break a bone, the reality of it is much grimmer. You can end up in hospital. You can then end up with a protracted hospital stay, and you can get muscle wastage from lying in a bed for all that time. You could contract a secondary infection in hospital. And in fact, often the breaking of a bone, particularly a hip, can be the beginning of the end for an older person. So it's just really stark, the difference between the severity of something that can happen in youth when your body's fit and healthy and in that state of very solid equilibrium that we talked about, say, in your 20s or 30s, versus what can happen if that same event happens to you when you're in your 80s. So back to that graph. This, therefore, is the end result of all those different processes. This is what happens to your risk of death with time. And it's worth saying that, when you die, you have to die of something. And I think this is a real misconception in the general public. Because I think a lot of people, when they imagine being older, they don't imagine these negative consequences. They don't imagine the diseases. They don't imagine being, stuck in hospital with a bladder catheter and an IV line inserted. What they imagine is, wrinkles, grey hair, growing old, playing with your grandkids, and that kind of thing. So it's worth looking at what happens to those risks of diseases, the chance of getting ill with one of these diseases every year. So I mentioned my 4 quote unquote favorite diseases: cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia. All of these things increase basically exponentially with a little bit of variation with age. And actually, dementia is a particularly striking example. Your risk of dementia before the age of 60 is basically 0, unless you've got some kind of genetic predisposition, you've got a mutation in a particular gene that makes it much more likely you'll get early onset dementia. Then it's basically unheard of, doesn't happen. However, if you get past the age of 60, then that risk of dementia doubles. It's less than every 5 years. That's rising faster even than the risk of death itself. It's a very strongly age-associated disease. So then we've got other stuff. We've got this horrible sort of green mucousy line here represents your risk of getting a chest infection. And what you can see is that it never gets very, very low throughout your life. Even someone in the sort of prime of young adulthood still got roughly a 2% chance a year of getting a serious chest infection. But there's this sort of bathtub shape to the curve. So you've got a high chance when you're at the low end of life, when you're a young kid and you haven't fully developed immunity to the various circulating viruses and bacteria and so on that exist. And then at the other end of life, the decline of your immune system just means you're that much more likely to get ill again. And actually, it's not just your chance of infection that goes through the roof when it comes to infectious disease. The other thing is this other one that's been in the news, and I'm going to look at the chance of death if you're infected with coronavirus. It looks a little bit like this. It's another dramatic exponential curve. And actually, this is one that goes up at a similar rate, maybe even a little bit faster than the risk of death overall. Your chance of death from coronavirus, if you're in your 80s, is literally hundreds of times greater than your chance of death if you're in your 30s. And this is for, we've already talked about the sort of weakening of the immune system, but it's also because your whole body's weakening. You reduce the quantity of what's called reserve in your whole body. So, your organ systems are getting worse. You're basically less able to withstand assault from some kind of external shock. And that's what coronavirus is. And that's why it's taking this absolutely enormous toll, particularly on the older members of the population. And I think actually this is something that if you're thinking about aging from an advocacy point of view, it's really, really worth not missing this opportunity, because this is a time when it's really laid bare the extent of the aging process. Because a lot of the time, all these different ways that you can die of aging, cancer, heart disease, stroke, etc., a lot of them happen behind closed doors. They happen in a hospital. They happen in a care home. They happen in a way that's a lot of society is insulated from. There was a really striking statistic I found out while researching the book, which is that the average age of somebody caring for a person over 65 is actually 63. And that statistic came from 2003. So my suspicion is it's probably got actually older since then. What that means is that a lot of people over the age of 65 have been cared for by spouses who are also, obviously deep in the aging process themselves, probably. Or they're being cared for by parents, and or rather, they're being cared for by their children. And I'm thinking of the example here of my parents. They're both in their 60s, and they're caring for my grandma, who's in her, I think she's in her 90s now, just about. So, as a young person, you can be incredibly insulated from this. But what coronavirus has done is really, really exposed this, because we've been confronted with these numbers every single day in the news, telling us how many people have died, telling us the huge numbers of older people that have been affected, telling us how this thing, unfortunately in the UK and a few other countries, has absolutely ravaged our care homes. It's really just exposed the fact that being old really is incredibly risky for your health. And that means, and what it's also shown us is that society is very prepared to respond to help out those older members of our population. So as advocates for the sort of broader field of research into aging and therefore caring about older people, this is something that we should really point to. We should say, if you care about older people now, if you're willing to try and do something to avert this problem, then you should be willing to do something to avert the far larger, constant, ongoing problem that is biological aging. And secondly, just another thing to emphasize related to sort of the advocacy side of coronavirus. If we went into this and we were all slightly less biologically old, we had slightly fitter immune systems, we were slightly more ready to deal with this threat from a sort of general bodily reserve point of view, then this curve could be shifted a little bit toward the older ages. And actually that would mean the impact of the pandemic globally could be much, much reduced compared to what it is now. So again, there's just this incredible opportunity to show people that aging is a really serious problem, because it's this stuff that's just been in the news constantly throughout the last year or so. So as I said, there's this sort of myth that you can just die of old age. And actually, until a few decades ago, it was possible to write old age on a death certificate, but we now know it's all of these different diseases. And this is sort of getting to the nub of why I think this is the world's greatest humanitarian challenge, because all of these diseases kill you quite slowly and in quite unpleasant ways. If you think about something like heart disease, it can gradually rob you of your ability to exercise, or, just to, and once, it's taken that away, it can remove your ability to, as I said, get around the house and do your sort of everyday stuff. Cancer is something that you can unfortunately end up in a battle with for years. The treatment's very onerous. And so these the ways that you die of these things, they aren't just something that you go to bed one night and then you wake up, or rather don't wake up the next morning having had a fairly painless experience. And obviously all these diseases, they're just the tip of the iceberg. The other things are the exponentially increasing rise in the risk of frailty, the risk of some kind of cognitive decline that doesn't quite make the threshold for dementia, and so on. So this really, really is an enormous challenge. But a lot of people then think, isn't this just something that we in the rich world are lucky enough to live long enough to experience? And so we're back to this graph. I think this is the penultimate time. And normally what I do in a non-Zoom talk environment, which I have done in the past, is a quiz about global life expectancy. So what I'm going to do is just let you, you have to think this in your own heads, I'm afraid. You're going to have to, I want you to think, how long do you think the average person, what's the average life expectancy across the whole of the planet Earth? So not just the rich countries, but all the different countries averaged together. I think I've left that hanging for long enough now. The answer is 72.6 years, or at least it was back in 2019. I guess we'll see if the coronavirus pandemic has caused a little dent in that or not. But basically, the point is that most people in most countries are living long enough to get at least a significant way up this curve that I've just been talking about. And that means this isn't a problem that we in the rich world are lucky enough to have. It's something that's a real global problem, something that's affecting everybody worldwide. And that's something I'm going to come back to a bit actually in the ethics section at the end of the talk. But if you take this risk of death and this exponentially increasing risk of death with age and the global life expectancy, and you combine all these statistics together, you find that of the 150,000 people on average who die every day on Earth, over 100,000 of them essentially die because of aging, because they're dying of things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, all these things I've just listed. And that means that even if you were to take all the other causes of death, add them together and then double it, you'd still have fewer deaths than are caused just by this single process, just by aging. So back to that graph, this is the very last time, I promise. The question is, what can we do about this? And the way that I like to present this is to think of other organisms. To think about, for example, this little thing here. This is called a hydra. It's a tiny little freshwater organism. It's about a centimeter long. And they first came to the interest of science because of their incredible regenerative powers. So basically, you can chop off any bit of a hydra that you like, and what you'll get is the first hydra will regenerate, and the second, or the bit, will turn into a second hydra. So they've got this absolutely incredible ability to, basically any tiny part of them can become a new hydra. It's incredible regenerative power. But as they were being studied in the lab, the scientists who were looking at them noticed they did something else rather amazing as well, which is they didn't seem to change in the rate at which they died, no matter how long ago they were born. And so obviously what they've been doing is watching these hydra for, I think it's about a decade or maybe a bit longer that they've been being observed in these lifespan experiments in the lab. And their risk of death isn't this exponentially rising curve like that for humans with this risk that doubles every 7 or 8 years. It looks more like this. And obviously we haven't done the experiment all the way out to 1,000 years, but it looks like their risk of death is sufficiently low. It's something like 0.2% a year. But if they were to be able to continue this out to a millennium, then about 10% of those hydra would still be alive. And what's really important to emphasize here is it isn't their sort of extreme longevity or extreme potential longevity that's the most exciting thing. It's the fact this risk of death doesn't change with time. And what this is telling us is that an exponentially increasing risk of death, or even any kind of increasing risk of death, isn't a law of biology. And I think this is a really accessible way to try and make this case. You're not trying to, you're not talking about extending human lifespan at first, or you're not talking about extending human health span. You're not verging into the sci-fi. By talking about animals, it makes it a lot more tangible and plausible. And obviously, hydra isn't necessarily the most tangible and plausible animal. These things are, they're tiny. They contain a handful of cells compared to the literally trillions in human beings. But there are some rather more friendly-looking and accessible animals that do have this same property. It's called negligible senescence, this risk of death that doesn't change as a function of how long ago you were born. So the reason that this beautiful animal is on the cover of my book, it's a Galapagos tortoise. The longest lived Galapagos tortoise made it to probably about 175, maybe 180 years old. She was called Harriet. There's this fascinating story that she may have been collected by Charles Darwin from the Galapagos Islands back when he was voyaging around, making some observations that would ultimately go on to inform his theory of evolution by natural selection. But again, what's most incredible about these tortoises isn't the fact they live to 175, it's the fact that they do so with this negligible senescence. And far more than a hydra, you can really see that these aren't it's not just their chance of death that remains constant with time. They also stay fit, they stay healthy, they don't become more frail, they don't lose reproductive capacity. In fact, the current oldest tortoise on the planet is thought to be an animal called Jonathan, living on the island of St. Helena. And there was an article in the Times a few years ago about how he still likes to have his way with the ladies. So he's very much maintaining that reproductive fitness, that general fitness, that sort of zest for life in a far more human terms, far, far beyond the age at which humans do. And people, sometimes ask, what do these tortoises die of? Well, Harriet died of a heart attack. The difference was she died of a heart attack at the age of 175 rather than maybe 75, which might be more typical of a human being. So having these animals as examples, as I say, just makes it seem more human's the wrong word, but sort of just less strange and less sci-fi and less like an out there idea. Something that's even closer to being a human being, might not necessarily look like it's particularly close to being a human being, but is evolutionarily a far closer cousin than a Galapagos tortoise, is this little beast, the naked mole rat. And again, this is thought to have negligible senescence. They scurry around in burrows, and we've been watching them in labs for decades now. The longest lives tend to stretch just about into their 30s. And once again, they do this without any apparent cost in terms of frailty, at least until very late in life. They carry on scurrying around. The reason they look quite so wrinkly isn't because they're aged. This could actually be quite a young adult. It's because they have to have quite loose skin in order to squeeze past the other naked mole rats in the tiny burrows that they inhabit. So in spite of this, they may not look like an icon for longevity, but in fact, they are this incredibly encouraging story. And not only do they have negligible senescence, but they've got incredible cancer resistance. It was thought until only a few years ago that they are entirely resistant to cancer, until finally scientists did uncover a few tumors in a few aging naked mole rats. But nonetheless, cancer is something that you find absolutely ubiquitously in old mice in the lab. They often die riddled with tumors if they don't die of one. So it's incredible that these rodents that are so closely related to mice can live, maybe 10 plus times longer, and also do so, apparently without a lot of this, without frailty and without many of these different age-related diseases as well. So what this shows us is that, as I said, aging isn't a law of biology. And the question is, how can we try and dodge this phenomenon that's called aging? You've probably all heard of dietary restriction, which is this idea that by eating substantially less, animals can then in turn live substantially longer. So I thought I wouldn't go into a huge amount of depth about that. What I thought I would do is tell you a story of a dietary restriction mimetic drug. So the idea is that rather than cutting back on our calories, we could try taking a drug that would mimic some or all of those effects. And I thought this was a story from the book that you might enjoy, you might not have heard, which is just a really fun part of the history of aging biology. And in order to tell this story, we have to travel to one of the most remote places on the planet Earth. So we need to go to the island of Rapa Nui, which is deep in the Pacific Ocean. It's about 3,500 kilometers from the coast of Chile. So it is one of the most remote, actually inhabited places on the planet. And this story starts back in the 1960s. And what was happening was that the Chilean government decided they wanted to build an airport on Rapa Nui. And so some scientists in Canada decided that this was an absolutely ideal opportunity to try to go and research this isolated, this completely pristine community, and not just the community, but the ecology as well, before an international airport came in and just sort of connected Rapa Nui to the rest of the world. Rapa Nui, by the way, is also known as Easter Island. And if you have heard of it, it's probably because of these giant stone heads called the moai, which are buried in the soil. We don't really, even to this day, entirely know what they're supposed to symbolize, but they've been there for hundreds or thousands of years. So it's this incredibly evocative location. And this expedition was absolutely incredible. It was eventful to the point of almost failing entirely, because during this time, the residents of Rapa Nui decided they didn't particularly like being ruled over by the Chilean government. And there was a revolution took place. It was thankfully largely, I think, entirely bloodless, although there were some shots fired. But during this time, the scientists managed to take a huge number of samples from the islanders, from different parts of the island, different parts of pieces of soil. And actually, probably the most significant thing to come out of this whole sampling mission was a single file of soil that was transported back on this ship to Canada and finally finally researched in the early 1970s. And what they found in this file of soil was a bacterium called Streptomyces hygroscopicus. And what they found in this bacterium was a molecule that had the ability to, it seemed, kill off any fungi that were placed on the petri dish next to it. This is sort of a similar experiment to the way that penicillin, the antibiotic, was discovered. Because if you put these bacteria down on the dish, you find that the fungi don't inhabit a little circle around those bacteria. And this molecule was dubbed Rapamycin, after Rapa Nui, the island on which it was discovered. And so this was initially thought, oh, this is great. Perhaps we can use this as a fungal antimicrobial in humans. What they rapidly found when they did a few more experiments was this seemed to do a couple of different things. It seemed to massively slow down cell division, and it also seemed to be a significant suppressor of the immune system. So these are not necessarily things you'd want in an antifungal, but it did offer two more perhaps much greater prizes here, which is that if it's something that stops cells dividing, maybe this could be used as an anti-cancer agent. And actually, spoiler alert, rapamycin is approved for certain kinds of cancer now. And secondly, since it seemed to suppress the immune system, maybe it could be used for exactly that, as an immune suppressant in patients who had transplants. But after about a decade researching it, the drug company Ageless, that was in charge of trying to turn this compound into something usable, basically shuttered the program. They decided that they couldn't work out how to turn this molecule into something that could work in human medicine. And the most kind of incredible and ridiculous part of this story is that a scientist from that company called Søren Segal took a sample of these bacteria and hid them in his freezer at home, because he was convinced there was something really important in this molecule and he didn't want the program to be shuttered. And it actually survived a house move with him, sealed in a box of dry ice in the freezer. And then eventually he did manage to convince his boss this was a really important compound. And as you gather from the spoiler alerts, it has turned out to have medical significance already. But obviously the reason I'm talking about it is because it's got anti-aging properties. It seemed to slow down aging in yeast when it was first tried out. It slowed down aging in mice as well. But actually that story, again, it's just nothing about rapamycin is simple, from the revolution on the island where it was first discovered to this ridiculous story of it hiding in the freezer. It was actually given to these mice, and it was given in their early life. They were hoping to give it to them throughout life and see what it did to their aging process. And what they found was that at when they first gave the rapamycin, the mice didn't seem to actually have any rapamycin in their blood supply. So there's clearly something wrong with the formulation. And by the time that formulation had been modified in such a way that it did successfully get through the mouse's digestive tract and make it into the bloodstream, the mice from the original experiment were already about 2 years old, which is something like 60 in mouse years. This is, already fairly advanced way through the experiment. And so a lot of people thought, well, this just isn't going to work. We're going to have given them this drug at an incredibly late stage. It might make some small marginal difference, but frankly, this is too late to intervene. But actually, it did work. And incredibly, these mice, even though they were given it in very, very late life, managed to live 10% longer. And again, what they found was that these mice lived longer in good health. So, they were living longer we've now discovered fewer age-related diseases and, less cognitive impairment and that kind of stuff. So rapamycin really does seem to be a genuine anti-aging compound. And as I said, it sort of works by mimicking the process of dietary restriction. We've since had some experiments with rapalogs, which are drugs that are like rapamycin, but not exactly, and some other drugs that have a similar mechanism of action. And we found that they can probably improve response to a flu vaccine. There's some controversy around those trials because there was basically a late stage trial that failed and it all got a bit complicated. And I wanted to tell you this story, firstly, because I think it's a really amazing story, but secondly, because it's very frustrating how idiosyncratic a lot of the history of aging biology research has been. How it required some bacterium to be discovered on some island and someone to be incredibly persistent and hang on to it in his freezer. Then ultimately, an almost failed mouse experiment, which nonetheless turned out to be successful. And it's these idiosyncratic bits of the history of aging biology that have gone on to provide us with the evidence that allow us to be so excited about the field today. So I was going to go back to this slide asking what is aging, and say, obviously what I've done here is actually cheat slightly. Whenever anyone shows you a slide like this, trying to list the various different pathologies and consequences of aging, every single one of the categories on this is actually, is a category. It's an enormous simplification of what's actually going on. Obviously, there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. There are a variety of different ways that your heart can go wrong. And, there are various different types of stroke. And that's just scratching the surface. There are, literally hundreds or even thousands of age-related diseases, depending on how you categorize them. So there are just loads and loads of different ways that your body can go wrong, these sort of endpoints. And the way that we treat them in modern medicine is very much one at a time. If you get cancer, or say you find a lump, you go to your GP. Your GP might refer you to an oncologist if they're worried about it. That oncologist will do some tests, and if they decide it is cancerous, they might operate or do chemotherapy or radiotherapy, and hopefully that cancer will get better. But during this whole time, nothing is done about the potentially large number of other problems that you might be suffering from. So, although obviously, unfortunately, young people can get diagnosed with cancer, as you saw from the graph a few slides ago, by far the majority of people who are diagnosed with cancer are much, much older. And that means they're often already struggling with a number of different problems at the same time. They might have a bit of a nascent heart problem or a bit of cognitive decline. They might even have a full-blown age-related disease. They might have got dementia already. And so that makes this treatment a whole lot more challenging because you're trying to do it within this body that's already suffering from the consequences of aging. So it would be great if we could come up with some medicines that could actually, deal with this whole process at once, rather than picking these things off in a piecemeal way, one at a time. And that's why I'm most excited about this list here, because now when we ask the question, what is aging? The advances in science, the advances in the science of biogerontology, finally mean that we can give something like a comprehensive answer. I'm not going to claim this list is every single thing, but we can look at these, what are called hallmarks of the aging process. And we can draw a number of conclusions from this. So these are actually the 10 hallmarks that I talk about in my book. If any of you are familiar with this term, the hallmarks of aging, from the 2013 paper of the same name, you'll know that they have 9, I've got 10. I mixed things up a little bit. I added the microbiome and merged and combined a couple of bits and bobs. So I ended up with 10 overall, basically. But what's exciting about these is, firstly, there are far fewer of them than there are the different age-related maladies. So, it's not that there are hundreds of kinds of cancer, and there are, although every one of these is a category itself, it's not as though there's the same slew of different things that's underneath each one of them. So this makes you optimistic that perhaps there are a smaller number of things that you could treat and potentially, hit many of those age-related conditions at once. They're also more fundamental. These are the sort of processes that cause all of those age-related diseases, rather than the variety of different endpoints that can manifest in a number of different ways. And the other thing that's exciting about them is that we have ideas to treat every single one of them. They're at various stages. There are some like senolytics that I mentioned at the top of the talk that are already in human trials. There are others like, perhaps ways we might try and fix our mitochondria, or things that we could do about DNA damage and mutations that are much earlier in the research and development process. But nonetheless, we have got ideas for every single one of these. So it's plausible that we could come up with treatments to deal with all of them. And it's also plausible that these are connected, and so we won't necessarily have to hit every single one of them to make a bit of progress. Obviously, I've not got time for the whole list. And as I mentioned, I think this audience will be very familiar with my normal go-to example, which is senescent cells, because I just feel like that is, because it's already in human trials, it's got quite a simple explanation. It's one of the most exciting, or probably the most exciting fields in biogerontology. What I thought I'd do is explain the effect of telomeres and telomerase, because I think this is a really interesting story. And again, it's one that you often get asked about at dinner parties when those are allowed again. Because people often, they heard of telomeres, that there was a Nobel Prize awarded for them back in 2009. They're well known as this sort of thing that might be a fundamental cause of aging that was once touted as a potential route to immortality. And the story of them, how they've gone from sort of this potential route to immortality to somewhat unloved in the noughties to being a little bit more in vogue these days, I think is a really fascinating one. So just to explain quickly what a telomere is, as I say, I'm sure this audience isn't entirely unfamiliar with that, but this is a fluorescence microscopy image of some DNA. The blue stuff is the chromosomes, which are arranged in this classic X shape that happens around cell division. The red and the green bits are the telomeres. These are these bits, these protective sections at the ends of the DNA, which serve a couple of different functions. If we zoom in on them, what you'll see is they're actually repetitions of the same pattern. It's TTA, GGG, hundreds or even thousands of times, this same sort of repeated pattern of 6 DNA letters. And this serves a couple of different functions. The first function is that it protects the end of the DNA, because if your cells were to find some loose ends of DNA, what your DNA repair mechanisms will do is try and sew those loose bits together, because I think something must have got broken. But these this repeated load of basically these repeated 6 letters allow the DNA to be protected, and the DNA repair mechanisms basically ignore it because of the different proteins that bind on there. The other thing that it does, which is the one that seems more relevant to aging, is that they solve a rather stupid almost problem in cell biology, which is that when your DNA replicates, when it duplicates all of the information in your chromosomes, when your cells divide, then what it does is it copies all the way along. But for some bizarre reason, evolution has created this DNA polymerase, this enzyme that duplicates your DNA. And it's created it in such a way that it can't quite make it to the end of the DNA molecule. And the analogy that I like is that if you imagine it's a builder trying to construct a wall, but they're simultaneously standing on that wall, and that means that she can't place the final brick. She's standing on the section of wall where she'd like to place that final brick. And that means that the wall, as you sort of get taller, gets shorter and shorter each time. And in the same way, every time the cell divides, then it chops off a little tiny bit of the end of the DNA. And the reason the telomeres help to solve that problem is because they're this repeated string of 6 letters. They aren't actually important genetic information. So if your cell loses a little bit of this telomere, it doesn't ultimately go on to matter. Whereas if we didn't have the telomeres and you lost a little bit of potentially important DNA at the end of every cell division, then that could become very problematic very quickly, because you'd lose important parts of your DNA instruction manual. So this seems like an obvious candidate for a cause of aging, because every time your cells divide, they lose a little bit of this telomere. And as you get older, we know that your cells will divide more and more times, because there are lots of tissues in your body where your cells are constantly being replaced, places like the skin, your guts, where the way that our bodies have chosen to deal with the environment that those cells find themselves in is just to make new ones all the time in order to try and replace the ones that have been damaged, the ones that have got old, the ones that have to basically fall off, slough off around your house. A significant fraction of the dust around your house is thought to be the remnants of these dead skin cells that are just dropping off your skin all the time. So let's look at a graph like this, which has a look at how old you are on the bottom, and then the length of your telomeres, that's in base pairs. So they're thousands long up the side. What you can see is a graph that looks something like this. So you can see that it's not the greatest correlation in the world. It's quite a sort of, it's quite a sprawled out mess, in fact, of people who have different lengths of telomeres. And this is the telomeres in their white blood cells, by the way. There is sort of a trend. It's about 20 base pairs per year is the average decrease in length of these white blood cell telomeres. But as you can see, there's a huge spread. So there are some people on this graph who are 20 years old who've got short telomeres, whose telomeres are similar in length to people who are even 80 or 90 years old who have the longer telomeres for their age group. But nonetheless, there is some evidence. I mean, there's clear evidence here that this does reduce, and these telomeres do reduce in length with age. The other thing that we know is that people who have shorter telomeres tend to do less well. So if you've got two identical twins and one's got shorter telomeres than the other, you find that the one with the shorter telomeres tends to get diseases sooner and die more quickly than the one who's got longer telomeres. So it looks like bad news. And that sort of plays out at the population level as well. People with shorter telomeres for their age tend to have less good health outcomes. So this really does seem like a candidate cause for aging. We've got a mechanism by which your telomeres can get shorter with age. We've got evidence that they do on the population level. We've got evidence that not only do they get shorter, but that people with shorter telomeres have worse outcomes. The question is, what can we do about it? And the answer, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, is this enzyme called telomerase. It's a naturally occurring enzyme that extends those telomeres. And there's there are obvious places where this is really important. For example, we've got to do this in the germline, the cells that go on to produce the next generation of any given animal, or in the case of humans, obviously babies. Because otherwise we'd end up with babies that had short telomeres, and then maybe they'd make it through their life just about, but their kids would then have even shorter telomeres, and the species would very rapidly run into trouble. So we've got to have a way of topping up the length of those telomeres, in that case at least. And in fact, there are several other cases around the body as well. And so this enzyme telomerase can extend those telomeres. The problem is, and this is the sort of narrative that came out of this in the late 90s, that was the excitement. We had these telomeres that were getting shorter. They were this clear candidate for a cause of age-related diseases. So it seemed like this exciting, there was cause for excitement because this enzyme could potentially extend all of our telomeres and thereby extend all of our lives. However, the telomerase bubble was basically popped in the late 90s and early 2000s. Because there's this dark side to telomerase. We know that if you think about cells that can divide an infinite number of times, because they've got telomeres that carry on extending, well, the first thing that should spring into your mind when you hear that sort of idea is cancer. Because what cancer is fundamentally is a cell that has the capacity to proliferate. It has the capacity to grow into a tumor, has the capacity then to potentially metastasize, move around your body, and that's how cancer ultimately goes on to kill you. And what scientists found was that if you get a mouse and you add telomerase, you just give it telomerase in its germline. So you give it, before the mouse is born. That means that the mouse has an extra copy of telomerase in every single one of its cells. Then those telomeres can keep on getting extended. But unfortunately, there is a side effect. And that side effect is, of course, cancer. It's not that telomerase directly causes cancer, but it's just that whenever a cancer forms from the various genetic mutations that the mice pick up throughout their lives, one of the things that the cancer has to work out how to do is to find a way to extend those telomeres and stop the cells running out of telomere. And the reason for that actually is because when the cells do have extremely short telomeres, the cells can go senescent, they can commit suicide because they know they divided too many times. So cancer has to find a way to either activate telomerase or come up with some other way of lengthening its telomeres. And that means that if you already have active telomerase in every single cell in the mouse, you're effectively pre-ticking a box on cancer's list. And so that's bad news. And that's, ultimately, unfortunately, it does seem to go on to cause cancer in mice. And so, as I say, this really popped the bubble for two reasons. Firstly, just the plain factual reason. This is risky. This is something that causes cancer. This isn't obviously therefore something we'd like to do with humans. But secondly, I just think it was delightfully cynical because, there's always got to be some cynicism in science, but particularly when people are talking about immortality or, eternal life. They've got this enzyme that seemed to have these incredible properties and, this elixir that we've been searching for generations. But of course, in fact, it turns out just to be cancer. So there's this incredibly sort of wonderfully cynical explanation. And I think that's one of the reasons this became so popular. But thankfully, some scientists did persist in doing this research. And the couple of pieces of research I'm going to cite now are from a lab in Spain headed by a woman called Maria Blasco. And what she's done is she's really persisted with telomerase at a time when I think a lot of people had really sort of, as I say, basically bought into the cynical narrative that, it might have some life lengthening or health span increasing properties, but basically it comes with this enormous risk of cancer. And one of the first experiments she did regarding this was back in 2008. She got some mice and didn't just add telomerase, but also added some other genes at the same time. And these other genes are basically anti-cancer genes. Biologists amongst you might have heard of P53, which is commonly known as the guardian of the genome. And what these three genes basically do is they're constantly on the lookout for problems in the cell, things that might be, look like they might be precancerous. So P53 can convince a cell if it's got DNA damage or mutations or other kinds of problem going on. One of the things it can do is convince that cell to commit suicide in a process called apoptosis. And P16 and ARF are also related to things like apoptosis and also cellular senescence, which is this, as I said, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with senescent cells already, but it's the idea that these cells can just stop dividing. And so, although that's not ideal, we might perhaps rather they committed suicide. Nonetheless, it means that not dividing anymore, and therefore they're not able to go on to cause cancer. And what they found was that by adding this combination of genes, not just telomerase, but also these sort of cancer preventative genes, the mice did live longer. They lived 40% longer, in fact, which is quite substantial. And they did so without any apparent extra risk of cancer. So I thought that was a really cool result. And I thought that was cool for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because of this sort of dogged persistence in the face of cynicism, demonstrating that telomerase, in fact, does have some potential utility for increasing the health and lifespan of mice. But secondly, because I think it shows us something really fascinating about how we can intervene in our own aging. And that's because you might think the idea of adding a single gene or manipulating a single gene is quite naive, because aging is a phenomenally complicated process. And so if we just go in and disable a particular gene or give ourselves an extra copy of one that seems to either be anti or pro longevity respectively, then of course we can expect problems, basically, because evolution, as the saying goes, is cleverer than you are. So if you make some incredibly naive, simplistic intervention where you just get rid of a gene or just add one, then of course it's not going to work. Of course there's going to be some terrible side effects, some terrible consequence that evolution understood, but you didn't. But I think what this demonstrates is that evolution has often made a set of trade-offs that isn't necessarily optimal for the conditions that we find ourselves in the modern world. Because evolution doesn't optimize for lifespan. Otherwise, mice would live as long as naked mole rats. They'd live 30 years rather than 2 or 3. The fact is that evolution optimizes for reproduction. It optimizes that optimizes that creatures want to pass on their genes to the next generation. And what this shows us is that in a lab environment where mice aren't necessarily incentivized purely to reproduce, then it can be advantageous to add, perhaps not a single gene, though occasionally that can happen sometimes as well, but by fairly judicious alteration of what's still quite a simple idea, because you're still just using telomerase and then some other genes we know to have an anti-cancer effect. You can nonetheless increase lifespan. And so this makes me more optimistic about things like gene therapies or drugs that target particular genes to increase our lifespan and health span. Because it seems that you don't have to be incredibly clever to outwit evolution, because you're optimizing for something different to what evolution was optimizing for. Where it was optimizing for reproduction, you might optimize for healthy lifespan. And that means that, this doesn't have to be some infinitely complicated, incredible, we don't have to have a full understanding of our biology and how we age in order to make interventions that can actually work. The final experiment in this I wanted to talk about that again provides a bit of optimism is another experiment from Blasco's lab, which is where you take a mouse and rather than giving it an extra copy of telomerase in every single cell in its whole body that's active from birth, they actually injected this telomerase in adult mice. They used a viral vector to insert an extra copy of the gene. But it was a temporary copy of the gene. It isn't one that integrates, as it's called, into the cell nucleus and therefore is sort of permanently attached to the mouse's DNA. It was just temporary. So it would express telomerase for a bit, it would extend those telomeres, and then basically that tiny bit of DNA would get gobbled up by something inside the cell that realized it shouldn't be there. And by doing this in this temporary way rather than permanently, they again found that the mice lived longer and they didn't get any additional cancer. And this is something that's really exciting as a prospect for human therapy, because it's basically directly transferable. We too could use this gene therapy. We could even use the adenovirus vector that they used in humans. It's not to say it's ready for the prime time, because it's going to be very difficult to make sure that gets into every single cell in an adult human body. But it's really cool that by doing this slightly more subtle intervention, where you just turn on telomerase briefly and then extend those telomeres a bit, you're not pre-ticking a box on cancer's list, because you're only potentially adding a few extra cell divisions while it munches through that last bit of telomere, but you're not giving it telomerase, you're not giving it the keys. And actually a similar experiment that I haven't got on this slide that they did as well, was they created some mice who had very long telomeres from birth, but didn't have any additional telomerase. And they found that, again, those mice lived longer in good health. So it really does seem like having long telomeres is good. And it's actually having active telomerase itself, which is the slightly risky thing. So that's, as I said, I'd talk a bit about one particular hallmark. I'm not going to mention all 10 of these because I haven't got time to go through them all. What I thought I'd do at the end of the talk is go into this rather more bizarre question. The reason I say this is a bizarre question is because if I was giving a talk, obviously, this society is somewhat different, because I think, you're all coming here wanting to hear about aging, and perhaps even, many of you might already agree with me that aging is this enormous humanitarian challenge. But what's really odd is that if you give a talk about aging almost anywhere, or as I said, if you go to a wedding and tell someone this is what you do, then they will ask you, what about overpopulation? Won't this cause inequality of access? Won't this only be available to the rich? Which is really strange, because if I told them I was working on a book on cancer research, there are some incredible new technologies that were going to allow us to cure childhood leukemia, or perhaps there was a malaria vaccine that was being developed and I'd written a book about that, then you wouldn't get these questions. People would just say, great. They wouldn't ask you what we're going to do with all these people who are now living longer lives, living healthier. They wouldn't say, won't these people get bored with all those extra healthy years that you've provided them with? So I think it's really strange, actually, on one level, this is something that happens. But on the other hand, it's very, very clear to me from my experience talking to people about this, that almost everybody places aging into a very different sort of cognitive, philosophical, sociological category to everything else in medicine. And I very much see it as a natural extension of the goals of modern medicine, because ultimately what modern medicine is about is making people live healthier, and then hopefully if they haven't got so many diseases, they'll go on to live longer as well. I really think that the moral case, the answer to this question, is completely watertight, but there are loads and loads of different rabbit holes to go down. So I thought I'd start by just talking about a couple of them and giving them as examples, because I think that a lot of the lessons from these couple of examples really do diversify across to the whole sort of range of ethical, so-called objections to the idea of treating aging. So I'll start with what, as I've already mentioned, is the most common one of these, and that's overpopulation. Loads of people say, what about overpopulation? What are we going to do with all those extra people? And there are an absolute plethora of different ways to answer this question. The first thing that I often say is that I don't even like the word overpopulation. And I think this applies whether or not we're talking about the context of, trying to treat aging and trying to increase healthy lifespan. Because the problem with the phrase or the word overpopulation is that it blames the human beings, the people, rather than the resources that they use. And not only that is, not only is that rather an unkind blame game, but it's also not reflective of how the distribution of resource usage is across the world. So if you look at something like carbon dioxide and climate change, that's causing climate change, I should say, then about half of global carbon dioxide emissions are emitted by roughly the richest billion people in the world. It depends on exactly how you count it and how you count emissions from different countries. But in essence, the richest handful of people are emitting as much carbon dioxide as the poorest, 6 or 7 billion people on the planet combined. And so what that means is that, even before we think about talking about aging, if we want to bring those 6 or 7 billion people up to, a quote unquote Western standard of living, the kind of standard of living that I think, most people watching this call are going to be enjoying, then we're going to have to come up with ways of doing that with a much smaller footprint on the planet. We're going to have to reduce our carbon emissions. We're going to have to reduce the amount of land that we use, the amount of different kinds of pollution we put out into the oceans and the atmosphere. All of these things are going to have to be brought drastically down just in order to bring our current population up to our current standard of living. So that's why I hate it being called overpopulation, because really it's about resource use. And not only that, it's resource use actually by a comparatively tiny fraction of the global population. So it's a problem that we're going to have to solve anyway. The question is, will doing something about aging make it much harder? So in order to sort of drill down into the specifics of this question, I decided to look at population projections. So we've obviously got a graph here. Along the bottom, we've got the year. Up the side, we've got global population. Back in 1999, global population passed 6 billion. In 2011 or so, it passed 7. And we're coming up on about 8 billion now. So this is the story basically so far. The question is what's going to happen in future. And this is a projection. It's called the UN medium variance. That's sort of their middle of the road, what they think is probably most likely to happen idea for human population. So as you can see, it's going from almost 8 billion today to something like 9.5, 10 billion people in the year 2050. So what I thought I'd do is, I'm not an expert demographic modeler by any stretch. So I thought I'd try the simplest thing I could possibly think of, which is that rather than trying to modify death rates and deal with the idea of treating aging, I'd just cancel death. And I'd cancel death in the very near future. I'd say in 2025, no one's going to die anymore. So what happens to population if we make that rather wild assumption? Well, this is what happens then. We cure death in 2025, and the population in 2050 goes from about 9.7 billion to about 11.6 billion. Now, that's not nothing, let's be clear. It's an extra 2 billion people. It's something like an additional 20% added to the population. But what you've got to do is, pit the two alternatives against one another here. On the one hand, we're potentially curing, or not just aging, in fact, but all death, which is, it would be an incredible humanitarian goal, because we'd alleviate this huge amount of suffering. The world would be a much greater, more wonderful place to live. And on the other hand, we're going to have to work 20% harder to solve problems like climate change and land use and that kind of stuff. I would absolutely happily work 20% harder to solve those problems if what I got in exchange was a cure for aging, a cure for cancer, a cure for heart disease, a cure for dementia, all of these things happening at the same time. So I think there's just no moral case to be made here. The costs of aging are so much greater than the cost of the additional population burden that this would provide. And there are also a few other things to say. Firstly, this is this is obviously a ridiculous idea. Not only does it mean we'd have to have cured not just aging, but actually death by the year 2025, we also have to have rolled out those medications or whatever it was across the entire world. So from a sort of ethical standpoint, I'd say this is a best case scenario. But if you're a population pessimist, this is the absolute worst case scenario. It's probably going to be substantially easier than this. The other thing that's worth mentioning is there is some substantial uncertainty in population projections. These are the high and low variants from the UN. And actually, the UN doesn't vary anything about life expectancy when it makes these projections, which I found quite astonishing in the first place. They only vary birth rates. And what they find is that by changing the birth rate a bit, you can have a substantial impact on the population. So there are loads of other factors that could go on to change our population other than just our progress in medical technology in late life. So I think singling out aging for criticism here is just not a very sensible idea at all. The final thing I'd like to say is that curing aging, were we to do it, or even making some inroads against aging, even slightly deferring some of these diseases, would have enormous economic repercussions. It would save us huge amounts of money because aging is incredibly expensive. If you think about the costs of health and social care, if you think about all the people having to give up work because they're sick themselves or because they want to look after an elderly friend or relative, this has an absolutely gigantic cost on the economy. And that means that when people are talking about not just overpopulation, but many of these issues, the sort of first order effect might be to make a particular issue harder. There are often issues we have to solve anyway. That's something I've already mentioned with the overpopulation. Maybe doing something about aging will make those things harder, but they forget the second order effect, which is that we're going to have a huge number of healthier people, which is going to reduce costs to healthcare systems. It's going to mean people can potentially work for longer, contribute to society more. And so the enormous savings that we make could then be redirected into doing something about aging, about these other problems. And there's a paper that was actually from quite a few years ago now called the longevity dividend, which calculated that even just slowing down aging by about 2.2 years, I don't know why they chose exactly 2.2, but there we are, would save the US from now to 2050 about $7 trillion, not billion, but trillion. That's an incredible amount of money from just this modest deferral of the aging process that could then be spent on all kinds of other things. So there's just this enormous economic incentive to do something about this. And then that economic incentive could be redirected to potentially alleviate some of the other things that perhaps a larger population might make harder. The other thing I thought I'd talk quickly about is inequality, which is something that, again, is a very common question. The first thing to say about inequality of access, I should say, to these anti-aging drugs, if you think that these things are going to be incredibly expensive and only accessible to a cabal of billionaires, the first thing you've got to realize is that that's mutually exclusive with the previous worry. We can't have something that dramatically increases global population and yet at the same time is only accessible to those who have absolutely ridiculous wealth. So, when you're worrying about the future, you've got to choose which thing you're going to worry about quite carefully and make sure they aren't mutually contradictory. But this is something that's potentially worth worrying about. The first thing to say is that actually a lot of these interventions that we're thinking about at the moment might come in the form of drugs. And drugs actually intrinsically are often pretty cheap. The example of metformin, which is a drug that's going to be used in a trial called TAME that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of in the US, hopefully starting relatively soon, costs literally pence per dose. And even though it's a drug that you have to take every day, the actual cost of it is going to be very small compared to the potential benefits. And because making drugs is often basically chemistry, then they do tend to be incredibly cheap once their patent has expired. So once the pharmaceutical companies had exclusive rights to sell it for something like, it's 20 years officially, but by the time they've done all the R&D, it's often more like sort of 10 or 15 years on average in reality. Once the drugs come off patent, they can often be manufactured generically for much lower prices. So it's not necessarily clear that these things are going to be very expensive. And the second thing I'd say is that in the book, I do talk about some much more advanced ideas for therapies, things like cell therapies and gene therapies and that kind of stuff. And it's not necessarily clear that those are going to be expensive for a very long time either. There have been some gene therapies approved for various blood diseases in the US, I think it was late last year. And there are some incredible headlines because the sticker price on these things is like $1.8 million. It's worth unpacking what that price actually comes from. The main reason these things are so expensive is because often these are blood diseases that affect you throughout your life. So if you gave one of these gene therapies to a child and it improved their healthy life for that entire span of time, whether you're the NHS trying to work out what to pay for a new therapy, or if you're an insurance company, and obviously in the US it's mostly done privately, then the way that you assess how much a drug is worth paying for is often in the number of quality adjusted years it will add to somebody's life. So if it's going to add a load of quality to basically every year of somebody's life, then that drug can be worth a huge amount of money, even if the cost of producing it isn't necessarily very high. And if you then drill down into what the costs of production actually are, then they often aren't that expensive. I say aren't that expensive. They're often in the sort of tens of thousands of dollars. And that's before we automate any of this stuff. A lot of this gene therapy and cell therapy is bleeding edge laboratory science. It's being done in the lab without any kind of robotics, any kind of automation. We're often very stringent on the safety of these things, which is absolutely right in these early stages. You've got to make sure at every stage that the cells are what you think they are. They aren't harboring any cancerous mutations and so on. But nonetheless, by the time we understand this a bit more, and perhaps we can skip a few stages because we know they're safe pretty much all the time, then these things are going to get much cheaper to do. So those are just a couple of examples of the most common moral objections that you get when you're talking about aging. But there's the whole plethora of them. I think the strongest way to answer them is always to reverse the question. And that's to say, imagine that you lived in a society, in a world where aging didn't exist. And you wanted to try and solve one of these problems. You want to try and solve overpopulation. So on a planet, we've got 20 billion people, we're absolutely ravaging the environment, but we haven't got any aging. People live, incredibly long, healthy lives. Would you invent aging to solve this problem? I really don't think that you would. And the reason being, I don't think you'd condemn billions of people to decades of suffering in order to try and solve overpopulation. You try and reduce cut people's carbon footprints. You try and reduce the amount of land they use. If all of that failed and literally the only option left to you was to kill people, which I'd argue should be an absolute last resort, then surely you'd do it in some painless way with a lethal injection or something, rather than by decades of suffering in the form of aging. And I think this applies actually to all of these ethical questions. The problem is that we're just very familiar with the status quo. We've got literally a whole lifetime to come to terms with the idea of growing old. And so when people suggest changing it, it sounds sci-fi, it can sound strange, and people come up with these moral objections. But I think if you reverse the question, it's really clear what the answer is. And so that means that none of these moral objections are sufficient to try and stop us developing these kinds of therapies. I just wanted to show you as one final point in this talk, and this is sort of relevant to the ethical and policy side of things as well. I've already made the economic case for trying to do something about aging, because it could have these potentially trillions of dollars worth of benefits, certainly if you add up all these numbers worldwide. But I thought I'd look at how the amount that we spend on aging research compares to these potential large benefits. And I'm going to concentrate on the US here for a reason that I'll explain in a second. These are the figures from the US of the costs of various age-related diseases, and they're the four that I've been banging on about throughout the talk. The cost of these chronic diseases: cancer, heart disease, stroke, and dementia. And all of these are the combined costs. They're not just the healthcare costs, but these broader costs to the economy, as I said, for caring responsibilities and people giving up work because they're unwell and so on. And as you can see, it's absolutely enormous sums of money here. These are the costs every year, and they're hundreds of billions of dollars each. The total cost is getting on for very close to $1 trillion. And obviously these aren't even all the age-related diseases. So the cost of aging is absolutely gigantic to the US economy. And yet let's compare that to the amount of money that's spent on the National Institute for Aging budget. It's about $3.5 billion. That square isn't just a little bullet point there. It's actually in proportion to the size of the amount of money that's spent. And even if you're purely motivated by the economics, this is just mind-bending, because you could use this tiny square to try and improve or reduce the economic cost of all of these diseases. But instead, we just spend this incredibly small amount of money. And actually, it's even worse than that, because if you drill down into the NIA's budget, then it looks a little bit like this. There's a running joke in the biogerontology community that NIA actually stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's, because the division of neuroscience here gets a huge fraction of its $3.5 billion budget. About $2 billion goes straight into looking at Alzheimer's disease, basically. And then other NIA stuff comes to about just over $1 billion. And that leaves about $350 million for the actual aging biology division of the NIA. And that's just an incredibly small amount of money, particularly when you consider that some of this work, or in fact, the majority of this work probably, is looking at the basic biology of aging. It's trying to understand why we age, basically investigating those hallmarks, how they change as we get older. And obviously, this is absolutely vital stuff. We need to understand how, how our biology changes with age before we can do anything about treating it. But we do need to invest some money in the R&D of the treatments themselves as well. And if you sort of run through all this maths, it's optimistically, the US spends 1/10,000th of the amount that it spends on healthcare on researching actual treatments for aging, which, given that aging is responsible for a huge fraction of those $4 trillion of healthcare costs that the US spends every year, is again just absolutely mind-blowing. And fundamentally, this is what I hope to be the result of writing this book, or at least this book can contribute towards making this case. Because I really wanted to raise awareness of this. I wanted to show people the exciting science. But I just wanted to get everybody talking about this. I wanted it to be, I want it to be a subject of conversation around dinner tables and in the pub when we can go back to pubs again. And I want voters to understand this, so they vote for politicians who want to invest in aging research. I want policymakers to understand that graph that I showed you on the previous slide and the huge potential of aging research to make a dent into it. And I also wanted to illustrate this to scientists as well, actually, because having changed career from physics to biology, what I found was that a lot of the biologists I was talking to didn't necessarily know that much about aging biology. They might not have had a lecture in it as an undergrad at all. My wife's a doctor, and when I started talking to her about this stuff, I think initially she thought I was crazy, but gradually, because, and again, sorry, I should say, because they haven't had any training in aging. If you get a geriatrics lecture as an undergrad medic, it's about dealing with people with complex comorbidities and taking lots of different medications. It's not about treating the aging process itself, it's trying to alleviate those problems. So we've really got a huge awareness raising task here. A huge amount of advocacy needs to be done. So what I wanted to do with this book was make an incredibly comprehensive guide to the science that could really seem robust and show people there's something serious to this, and also provide an introduction that allows people to make this case in the strongest possible way. So I really hope that, not just doing a book sales pitch here, but I really hope that you can go out and buy this and recommend this to people to try and raise the profile of this field. So I thought, just to finish, I'll give you a few links. If you want to get yourself a copy of the book, you can visit ageless.link to grab one. I'm on Twitter as @Stato, and I've also got a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Dr. Andrew Steele, which hasn't had quite as many uploads as I would have liked recently, because I've been slightly busy launching my book, and I suspect that's going to continue for the next month with the US launch coming up. But hopefully there'll be more stuff about aging and ethics and all that kind of thing coming there soon. So I think that's about it from me. I've got time for some questions.
Wow, what an absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you so much, Andrew. I've seen that the chat has been quite lively, which is great. And I have a feeling that our discussion will be just as rich. So I'll just dive in and go down the list. I see that Bridget, that you've been engaging others on the chat, so thank you for that. I'll start with Jerry. He was asking what your thoughts are about vitamins and longevity.
I actually say in the book, I've got a chapter on health advice, and one of my pieces of health advice is don't bother with supplements. And that's because unless you have, and this is the important disclaimer, unless you have a vitamin deficiency that's known, that your doctor's identified, and therefore you need to take a particular supplement. The big systematic reviews, which is where you take all of the different experiments that have ever been done and combine them together into a big super trial, basically, show that these supplements have no effect. They either have no effect on longevity, or there are a handful of supplements that actually reduce or they increase your chance of death, so they effectively reduce your lifespan. And I think that this actually stems from some quite simplistic ideas in the history of aging in the past. We thought that aging was caused by things like oxidative damage. And so by taking antioxidant supplements, we could perhaps mop up some of this damage. What we've discovered in the last decade or two is basically that theory was far too oversimplified. And in fact, it's surprising that we didn't come to that conclusion before that, because we had studies looking at antioxidants in mice in the 70s and 80s that really showed they had no effect. But so tenaciously was this theory clung onto that people are still taking supplements in huge numbers now. So yeah, I don't think there's anything to supplementation, unfortunately. So we just got to watch this space until there's something that is worth taking.
Brilliant. Marina is curious, so which hallmark of aging do you consider the most important one?
That's a brilliant question, and I'm afraid the answer is I just don't know, because I think the way that we're going to find out what's the most important is by basically fixing them one at a time and seeing what changes. I think something that we're very fortunate with is that these senolytic drugs that can kill senescent cells, one of the hallmarks of aging, seem to have this incredibly widespread effect. They improve mouse cognition, they reduce cancer risk, they reduce risk of heart disease, they make the mice look better, they have better fur, they can run further and faster on treadmills, so clearly it's having some effect on their muscles. So we might find that there are certain hallmarks like that have this sort of huge networked effect, or it might even be that all of them have quite a networked effect, because all of these things are very, very interrelated. But I think the honest answer to that question is that, and I make this case in the book, the best way to fully understand aging biology is actually the same as the best way to try and treat aging, which is to tick off those hallmarks one at a time in ways that we can try and treat them and see what effect that has on the biology of aging animals and humans. And I think only then will we truly be able to answer that question.
Thank you. And Ingrid is, she's curious, how does stress or trauma affect the natural aging process in aging? And is there a specific number of years that trauma can age you?
It's a good question. I think the best research that's been done on this in terms of aging is looking at telomere length. And there's some quite good evidence that having a sort of traumatic or stressful childhood can reduce the length of your telomeres. Unfortunately, as you saw from that graph that I showed you in the talk, telomere length compared to age is it's not the tightest of relationships, right? So it's very hard to say, oh, your telomeres are 1,000 base pairs shorter, therefore you're going to live X years fewer or something like that. It's not quite a simpler relationship. But there is definitely something there, and it's definitely worth trying to reduce the stress in your own life if you can. And it's something that we should worry about from a social policy perspective as well. We should try and reduce money stress and all kinds of other external forms of stress on people's lives to try and improve their health. But it's not got the clearest cut answer yet. I guess it's going to be a knotty piece of sort of cross-disciplinary social science and biology research to try and pin down what the mechanisms are and how that all works.
Thank you. Michael was asking, what about the impact of intermittent fasting or fasting in general on overall biology, disease, and body health?
It's a fascinating question. I've I found those chapters, or it actually ended up being 2 sections in the book on dietary restriction and fasting and stuff, the most infuriating parts to research and to write, because the whole time you sort of feel like you're on the cusp of understanding the perfect diet. There must be some like combination of quantity of protein, quantity of calories, how these things all interact, and when you eat as well, that could optimize your lifespan. But the more I read, the more I was convinced that actually we are literally going to have cured aging. We're going to fully, we're going to understand enough about those hallmarks that we can treat them in a way that prolongs human lifespan fantastically before we fully nail down everything there is to understand about nutrition. I think there's some good evidence that dietary restriction and perhaps fasting improve health markers in the short term. So when people do these studies, what they find is they tend to have lower blood cholesterol, better fasting glucose, the amount of sugar that's in your system after you haven't eaten for a while. So better sort of control, using their insulin and stuff like that. But what's really, really hard is trying to find, obviously what the ideal study, quote unquote, would be to have an 80-year-long trial during which we restricted what people ate in particular ways. And obviously, there are ethical and practical problems that might occur with that. And quite apart from anything else, by the time we've waited for those trials to come out, if you're waiting to modify your diet based on them, you might be dead already. So I think it's really, really tricky. I ended up deciding that actually the disbenefits of dietary restriction and fasting probably outweigh the benefits, because there are some serious side effects too. The best studies for dietary restriction that got people doing it, there was a study called Calorie, which is a very tortured acronym that I can't remember what it stands for. But what they found was that some people they found basically, first thing they found was that people couldn't restrict their calories as much as they were aiming to do. So that was the first issue. The second one was that there were some people who had to drop out of the study because they had problems with their immunity, they had problems with bone density, they had problems with anemia. So it's not like these things are side effect free. People who calorie restrict also report they feel cold all the time. The hunger doesn't ever go away. You might hope that you settle into some new metabolic state after a few months or a few years, and it sort of feels fine. You just feel hungry all the time. There are problems. I say problems. There's reduced sex drive, which I guess could be a problem or a benefit depending on the individual. But the point being that there's this vast, wide-ranging effects on your biology. For what's very difficult to pin down is, if someone said to me, you're going to have all these side effects, but you're going to live 10 years longer, and it's all going to be in great health, then, maybe I could overcome the challenges of being hungry and the challenges of all these side effects. But honestly, I think it's so uncertain. I've got a lot of respect for people who do it, but the cost benefit calculation for me just doesn't quite come down on the right side.
That's really great to know. William is asking what your thoughts are on ROS. I think that does stand for reactive oxidative species.
Yes, reactive oxygen species, and that alludes to what I was talking about before with the supplements.
Right.
So there was this very long period of time in aging biology where it was thought that the primary driver of aging was damaged by these reactive oxygen species. So when you eat something, when you eat, what you get basically, in a very simplified sense, is sugar and oxygen. And both of those are by their nature very reactive molecules. Like they have to be, otherwise they wouldn't be able to generate the energy in your cells. And when the mitochondria in your cells are generating energy from these various different chemicals, they can sometimes fumble on oxygen. And what that can do is create a free radical, a reactive oxygen species. And that can zip around the cell, damaging bits of the cell. It can knock electrons off stuff and cause all kinds of chemistry to happen. And basically what that can do is it can damage your DNA, it can damage your proteins. And so the idea was that as you went through life, this inevitable damage would accrue. And slowly but surely, and not even slowly but surely, it would cause a vicious spiral, because as that damage accrued, it would make your mitochondria more likely to fumble one of these oxygens, and thus, create even more of these reactive oxygen species, which slowly worsen your prognosis. I don't think that this is like being completely wiped off, in the sense that it is still clearly the case that our reactive oxygen species can that reactive oxygen species, sorry, can damage DNA, they can damage proteins. So clearly that's going to happen inside our cells. The question is, to what extent is it a driver of aging? And in the sort of negative corner, we've got one example. I think the most striking example I've read about is where you remove the genes for our natural antioxidants, so effectively our natural enzymes that get rid of these reactive oxygen species. And what you find is that it often makes very little difference to the lifespan of the organism. So there's an enzyme called superoxide dismutase, which is called SOD in worm biology. And they got rid of all the SOD genes, which is SOD 1 to 5, in the worms. And what they found was that these worms are absolutely riddled with oxidative damage, but they didn't live any shorter than their sort of worm compatriots who had a full complement of these antioxidant genes. So it's clearly a more nuanced picture. The other aspect that makes us think it's more nuanced is we now understand that these molecules, or these chemicals, basically have they've got a signaling role. They've got all kinds of different roles, in fact, inside the body. So they can be used by the mitochondria to communicate stuff inside the cell. I think the coolest thing they're used for is actually immune cells can bombard an invading bacterium with reactive oxygen species and basically kill it by causing it huge amounts of oxidative damage. So clearly you wouldn't want to reduce your levels of ROS down to such a low level that your immune system couldn't perform these essential functions. So the story's got a lot more nuanced. I don't think they've been written out completely, as some people would make the case, but equally, they're no longer like the central pillar of aging biology that they once were.
Well, thank you so much. That's really great to know. Alex is asking, is there any effort to coordinate between various rejuvenation projects, such as SENS, Sinclair, or Calico?
I think there's in those three examples, there isn't really, because Calico, for example, is just so incredibly secretive. We've got very little idea what they're doing. I spoke to a scientist from Calico as part of the research for the book, who was looking at genealogical records and trying to work out the heritability of longevity. And they just seem to have this array of bizarre projects. And you get these little sort of chinks. Bizarre is unfair, that they're doing useful and interesting work. And this guy I spoke to, the project was really fascinating, demonstrating just how little of our lifespan is encoded in our genes. It's really interesting work. But you sort of get these chinks when one of these papers is published, and trying to like put together those chinks and what exactly they're doing is very complicated indeed. And I think Sinclair and Sense are both taking quite different approaches. David Sinclair is promoting this information theory of aging idea, that it's all basically down to the epigenetics. And Sense is taking a much more holistic approach, but for some reason actually seems to minimize the epigenetic contribution to some extent. So I think there's, they could probably all do with talking to each other, because I suspect they've all probably got something right.
Mm. And I think the last question for the evening is going to be from Barbara. Sorry, there's still a lot of questions, but I did notice that we're a little bit going over, but this has been really great. The last question is it not the case that aging is the price we have to pay for how we have evolved to be?
I don't think it is, no. And I think the strongest argument for that is these other animals that don't age, and that they don't age in a statistical sense, they don't age in a biological sense. They maintain their youth throughout their lives. Actually, I think the most fascinating theory I came across was that the reason that humans, and indeed basically all mammals, age, which is quite surprising because there are lots of these examples, in fish. I mentioned these couple with naked mole rats. Naked mole rats are mammals, and they probably are negligibly senescent, but the vast majority of mammals age. And one theory that I came across with this was that there was an evolutionary bottleneck, basically, because when the asteroid hit and wiped out the dinosaurs, all mammals, basically, our last common ancestor is probably something a bit like a tiny shrew that was scurrying around on the floor in sort of prehistoric times, 65 million years ago. And when you think about animals that are very small, things like mice and shrews today, they have very short lifespans. They age very rapidly. And the reason for that is they find themselves in a very perilous environment. So they've got to basically gear up, reproduce as fast as possible. And evolution doesn't really care about giving them, really delicate anti-cancer defenses or incredible ways to rejuvenate their heart into their 5th or 6th year, because they're going to have been eaten or died of a disease, or even just died of exposure because it's so cold and they've got tiny little bodies and a huge surface area to volume ratio. So evolution has optimized them for pumping out kids and then just dying. And so the theory was that perhaps all mammals have basically been cursed by this evolutionary bottleneck. And so even humans are comparatively large and long-lived in the sort of scheme of things, mammal-wise. But nonetheless, we've got this sort of combination of genes, and there's no small tweak that evolution can make to get us off this aging pathway. It can defer aging, it can make things like whales live for potentially a couple of centuries, but it can't ultimately literally switch it off and cause full negligible senescence, perhaps because of this bottleneck. So I don't think it is a price of how we've evolved. I think it's probably something that's quite contingent. And I think that the idea that it's natural just doesn't really stand up to scrutiny if you look around the rest of the natural world.